Well, that's the thing about warming up with no evaluation, no requirements. The only thing is to warm up. So I have these techniques where, you just swing your arms and you just move your hands around. You're not worried about pitch, you're not worried about quality of sound. So once you're warm, then you can start moving into scales and pitch.
Welcome to another episode of Contrabass Conversations, your show covering life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath. So glad to have you here, and visit our site at contrabassconversations.com for all the details about what's going on. And I'd love to hear from you. Send me a message, feedback at contrabassconversations.com. Let me know a little bit about yourself. That would be great. Today, we're chatting with Patrick Neher, who I first met over 20 years ago at Northwestern University. And I've followed along with his career ever since. He's been somebody that I've been wanting to have on the show for years and years. And I think it was a photo on Facebook of Barry Green, Paul Ellison, maybe François Rabbath, and Patrick. And I realized I haven't spoken with Patrick. Got to talk with Patrick. Got on the line with him, had such a great conversation. We cover such a wide range of topics, including starting on the cello and making the move over to bass for Patrick, how he eventually ended up studying with David Walter at Juilliard. That's a very good story. His career at the University of Arizona teaching bass and cross-disciplinary collaborations as well. And now this new phase of life, he's moved out to Bellingham, Washington. He's composing. He's composed for years, active composer. He's recorded many solo albums. Very active artist. So we'll be hearing some excerpts from two of his solo albums, Music for Friends 2 and Soliloquy. And you can find links to these and Patrick's other albums in the show notes for this episode. I'd also like to thank D'Addario Strings for sponsoring the podcast. And I'd encourage you to check out our new giveaway with D'Addario. D'Addario is going to be giving away a set of orchestra, pizzicato, and hybrid strings in their helicore line. And you can enter that at contrabassconversations.com/strings. I've used the D'Addario orchestral helicore many times in the past, as well as the hybrid strings. The hybrid strings are a balance between the pizzicato sustained sound of their pizzicato strings, and they still have a quick bow response, like their orchestral strings. They're used by Daniel Kimbrough, who we're going to have on the show pretty soon, Barry Bales, Larry Grenadier, many other artists. All their strings are crafted, engineered, designed at the D'Addario String Factory in New York. And thank you, D'Addario, for sponsoring the podcast. I'd also like to thank Bass Capos for providing hosting for Contrabass Conversations. Bass Capos are a great choice if you're looking to implement a double bass extension. Easy to install and adjust, cheaper and more reliable than hand-built latches, light and quick to operate. And you can learn more at basscapos.com. Okay, here we go with our conversation with Patrick Neher. Are you in Bellingham now? Where are you?
Yeah, that's where I live, Bellingham.
Okay. I have family in Seattle, and one of my aunts and uncles they launched their boat out of Bellingham, I think. Isn't it like north of Seattle, about an hour or?
Hour and a half north, and it's got great marina, and yeah, it's super nice. It's just exactly the opposite of where I used to live, which is really great.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, you couldn't pick probably a more contrasting climate than like Arizona to Pacific Northwest. That's fantastic. Well, I just moved out to San Francisco after being in Chicago for 20 some odd years. So
yeah,
I'm enjoying San Francisco for sure. But it was cool that you recorded Shinji's piece. So you studied with David Walter, right? So did you know Shinji back in school, or?
Yeah, we were classmates.
You were? Okay, cool.
Essentially, I think he was a year ahead of me, but only by a year. I mean, we've seen each other a lot. I think we used to like hang out in New York quite a bit because we were in a number of orchestras together,
And
I was in like 5 orchestras a week in New York when I lived there.
Were you really? Man.
Freelancing, and carrying my bass all over the place. Yeah. And back then they didn't have wheels, so I had this big, huge 44-inch string length RV. It was an RV with an extension and everything. And I was carrying that on my back to everywhere, and I carried a stool then too. And I don't do that anymore. Now it's a little bass and no stools. Yeah.
Nothing is a cure for wanting to play on a stool than having to take the subway with your bass. I did that a lot in Chicago, like the L, and it's icy walking up to the steps. And
I know. And then some guy with his typewriter was in New York, it's very crowded, and he's walking by real fast with a typewriter in a case. This is back when we had typewriters, And he smacked my bass and took a big chunk out of it, And of course, he didn't even lose step in his massive walk going wherever he was going. I turn around, I'm like, and I get to the rehearsal hall, and there's this chunk out of my bass. I'm like, oh.
My favorite move in Chicago, the commuter train would get so crowded that I could only stand in the doorway, and I'd have to put my arm on the ceiling, right, and just try to maintain balance so I didn't go plummeting.
I found having the bass with me on the subway though was always a good icebreaker for picking up. Actually, they would pick me up. I actually never picked up anybody on the subway, but a lot of times a woman would approach me and say, "Hey, I see you play the bass. Where do you play? And blah blah blah. And can I see you later?" And no. I'm just going to school.
Well, it's a good conversation starter, though, carrying one of those things around, right? And you seem very non-threatening with the bass. You're not going to chase after them or anything.
Yeah, right. You can't move. You can't move very fast.
We also talk about Frank Proto and what a major influence he was on Patrick.
He was the big, example for everything that David Walter would say. Well, Frank Proto does it this way, and Frank Proto does this. I'm like, who is this Frank Proto guy? So eventually he and I, became very good friends, and we still are. And he's sort of been my mentor for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I had the chance to meet him for the first time in Prague. I went to the bass convention in Prague, and they celebrated his 75th birthday, which was really cool. They played I don't know if you've ever played his bass quartet or before. Right. So not easy, right? And they played Simon Marciniak and 3 other players got together on, I think, 1 or 2 rehearsals, put it together and played it. Can you imagine?
Yeah. Well, when I was in school, there was the Schuller quartet, which is supposedly unplayable, right?
Yeah.
So as students, we all got together and just put it together. I was like, this is not unplayable, Right. But back when it was recorded by with Schuller conducting them, who was that done by? It was like Stuart Sankey or somebody. I mean, it was a long time ago, right? And Schuller was conducting. And he says, "Well, this is not unplayable. It just takes a lot of rehearsal, So we did it. We did it as students, and we also did the Proto. So we did the Proto and Schuller on the same show. Yeah, it was a bass quartet show. That was 1974 or something. Yeah, bass playing's come a long ways, man.
How long were you in New York after you finished up at Juilliard? Were you freelancing there for a few years, or how did that work?
I'm a small country guy, I like small towns. I came from Nowheresville, New Mexico, and so the big city of New York was kind of frightening to me all the way until I even graduated, and so the first thing I wanted to do was get out of there. Also, we experienced that terrible recession back in 1978, 79, 80. It was really terrible, and New York was broke, and there was a lot of crime, and I was there there was a blackout on August 13th, 1979. And the city looted itself, and it just sort of imploded. And that was just my catalyst to get out of there as soon as I could. So I knew I cut my career foot off. If I had stayed there, I probably would have done great things,
But man, I can't even imagine what it must have been back like late 70s. I think about like Taxi Driver or some of those movies. It's like, that was like the era when it seemed like big cities were just going to fail, right? Like I can't even imagine what it must have been like being there around then.
It was tough. I was like Shinji and I were both, freelancing, and but I was playing in 5 orchestras a week just to make enough money to pay my rent, which wasn't very much, at that time. If we think about it in actual dollar amounts, I think I was paying like $155 a month. That was my half of the rent on an apartment that was at 69th and Broadway, so it was only 3 blocks from school, but. All the expenses of traveling around and eating and going to school. Yeah, I had to freelance in order to pay. I had good scholarship at Juilliard, but I still had to pay my living expenses, and so I just freelanced everywhere. It was, it was a good experience, but it did give me tendinitis and bursitis for 10 years after that, which I had to figure out why I got it. It was the technique I was using, and plus I was playing on a bass that was too large. Eventually I sold that bass to a guy in the Tucson Symphony. I was principal bass in the Tucson Symphony for 10 years. And then I sold the bass to him, to this guy, Jeff Hamilton. He really liked the bass. I said, great, because I need to downsize. That was part of my convalescence. So it took me about 6 to 10 years to get rid of the tendinitis, and then studying with François Rabbath was the way to move forward as far as my technique is concerned, and also it relieved a lot of the problems that I was having. So it was my approach that was giving me these problems. I went from sitting to standing, and I don't raise my arm up anymore, and all that kind of thing, because that's a bursitis thing. So I learned all that stuff, after college.
When did you first discover Rabbath's playing? Was that here in the States, or where did that happen?
Yeah. Okay. So I was teaching at the University of Arizona at the time, and I had been teaching there probably, at least 15 years. And I met François, along with. I think it was recommended that I go to one of his things in Cincinnati by Barry Green. Now, I had studied with Barry before that at the Congress of Strings, which was held. It was an old thing that doesn't exist anymore, but it was really great. Congress of Strings was held in Cincinnati at the conservatory there, and so I studied with Barry and also Lucas Drew at the time. And so they both recommended that I go to this Rabbath seminar that was being held, and I'm trying to remember the year. I think it was like 96 probably, 95, 96, something like that. And I brought a whole bunch of my students. So we put all the basses in a trailer, right? We rented a U-Haul trailer, and we put like 10 basses. I brought a lot of my students in the trailer, and then we dragged it along with this Azusa Trooper, which was gutless, and we camped out in the trailer, and we made it all the way to Cincinnati from Tucson, and then we did the seminar. And I think that's when I first started working with François. I had seen him in Los Angeles at the one of the ISB conventions. Yeah, that's when I first actually met him face to face. It was an ISB convention in Los Angeles. Must have been 95, 94, somewhere in there. And I just, of course, anybody who sees him plays is amazed by his abilities. And what I was so taken with was the ease at which he moved, and the complete ease at playing the instrument. I just wanted to know how he did that. So after the concert, I went up to him and I asked him, I said, how do you do this? He said, oh, yeah, that's easy. I can tell you in 1 minute, right? No. So he said, well, you need to come study with me. And I said, okay. And now at that time, Paul Ellison had already been studying with him, so the ice had been broken as far as old guys studying with him, right?
Sure.
And so I said, well, what would I have to do to be a student? He said, well, you have to play for me, of course. And I said, okay, and I played for him right then. And I was playing on a relatively larger instrument and a bow that was a German-made French bow, as a Winkler. Might have it over here. In fact, yeah, it's right here. This is my first bow.
All right.
This is a Franz Winkler. So it's made in Germany, but it's a French bow. But it's got to be a German stick because it's freaking long.
Yeah.
It's really too long, and it's kind of heavy. And I was playing this, and François says, took me your bow, took me your bow. So he says, what is this not such a great bow? And I said, well, it's a bow. He says, you need to change your bow and you need to change your bass and all that. And then you can come study with me. I said, oh, God. So I did. And I went to study with him, and I studied with him on and off for 7 years. I would go every time I had a break at the university. And sometimes I'd even take a 4-day weekend. I would fly out on Thursday to Paris, and I would fly back on Monday, I'd take a lesson with him, and it was absolutely worth every penny I spent and all the time I spent. It really completely changed my life. And I ended up spending an entire sabbatical leave with him, which was about a 7-month thing where I lived in Paris and worked with him at least twice a week. And it was just, life-changing. And it really fixed my tendonitis and bursitis and all the things I had in my wrist, all from playing the big bass. I went from a technique that has this sort of what I call block technique, which is very useful. You go tuck, 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 tuck everywhere, to an open hand technique, which is François' thing. So he has these open hand and a relaxed or closed hand thing. And so that was the left hand. Yeah, but that wasn't the primary thing. The primary thing was the right hand. And, already I was pretty fluid. I started on cello, so I had this sort of cello technique anyway on the bass. And it was already pretty fluid, but listening to what I was making was the thing that I got from him. I wasn't really hearing the sounds that I was making. He used to say, he says, Patrick, very good bass player, but you're deaf. You don't listen. So it was really great for me to really, really focus on listening. He had me, for the first month doing nothing but for a whole month. And I just played, just trying to get an even sound from one end of the bow to the other and making the up bow sound exactly like the down bow. It was really super intense listening. And that was worth hanging out with him. And then lessons would be anywhere from, 1 hour minimum to 6 hours. We just sit there and do lessons all day. And, a little bit of, come, let's have a Turkish coffee. And we'd have coffee, and then we'd have lesson, and we'd have coffee. And I'd be all buzzed up by the end of the
That's a great image. I love. Well, that must have totally changed your approach to teaching the bass too, right? Because you were at the university. Like, what? It might be hard to remember, but like, what are some of the big things that changed in the way you approached your students at the university?
Well, this whole thing about, I developed some things that were some ideas of François that I sort of made more understandable for students, particularly those that don't speak French, So I went from understanding sort of the way in which muscles work. And of course, part of the problem was, I had tendonitis and bursitis, so I had to understand the physicality of that. So I was reading anatomy books and things like that. So I went from teaching an approach that was really based in Simandl to one that's based in what is your physique most efficiently going to do what you want to do. And so I started thinking about the construction of the body, the way the muscles are and the tendons and all of these things. I had to understand that in order to solve my own tendinitis. I had to see, okay, the tendons go this way and they are attached down here, and there's all these going through the wrist, and there's the carpal tunnel and all these things. I developed something called a natural tempo, natural forms approach. So when you're relaxed, the hand takes a certain form. The hands, when they're relaxed, they're sort of, arched, the fingers arched and everything. So you want to apply that form to the instrument and then just support the form, rather than saying, okay, you got to go like this and this is your position, No, you just, what is your natural form? And then you apply that to the instrument. Anyway, so some videos on this. You can see them on YouTube. But the idea of natural form and then natural tempo, when you swing your arm, if you're just standing there and you're swinging your arm, you get a certain sort of tempo that feels good, like you can do it all day. I call that the natural tempo. When you walk, if you're walking with your grandmother, you're walking too slow and it's really irritating for you. If you're trying to catch up with your brother, it's too fast. So those are not what I would call the natural tempo that you would normally take. You can do all day. But if you're just walking down the street and you're trying to get somewhere and but you're not trying to get somewhere, you're just, a regular tempo, something you feel like you can do all day, that's the natural tempo. So there is that tempo for your swinging your arm. There's a tempo for your blinking of your eyes. There's a tempo for your heart, your breathing. So those are all sort of natural tempos, and I try to use those as a basis of all other tempos. And know that you stress your body when you go faster and when you go slower than natural tempos. And so that developed a sort of approach to many different techniques, but one in particular is warm-up. We often go, okay, my teacher says I have to warm up this way. Right? You do slow scales to warm up. No, those are incredibly stressful. Right? First thing you should do is swing your arms at a natural tempo. Move your fingers at a natural tempo. Look how freaking fast that is. I can do that all day. I can sit there and go like that all day. In the other direction too. So I apply that to the bass. I go until I decide, okay, I'm warm. That may take anywhere from 5 minutes to 30 minutes. It depends on your own physique. You have to feel it. Okay, I feel like I'm warm and ready to go. Now I start to practice slow scales. I start to practice fast scales. I practice things faster than natural tempo, right? Is natural tempo, so I would go right, really, really fast. So this is an approach where your muscles need to be warmed up, and then you start to stress them once they're warmed up. Otherwise, you give yourself tendinitis, you give yourself bursitis, things. This is what happens with students when they're young and they think they can do anything. They go to a rehearsal and they start playing Beethoven Ninth, I'm like, talk about stressful, right? And that's what, and the muscles, they're not ready. They're not warmed up. And, like a marathon runner is not going to just run a marathon. They're going to start by warming up, stretching, doing all these things. So I developed all these kinds of little things that I do for students to get them ready to play. Even in their lesson, I'll say, are you warmed up? And yeah, or no. I just came from math class, and I'm like, okay, we got to go through a warm-up routine. It may take you 5, it might take you 20 minutes, but because you didn't warm up before your lesson, we have to do it now, or you might injure yourself. None of my students, none, have tendinitis or bursitis. It's really a mental approach. And this is a thing that François is really good about. He's really good about looking at your physique. It gives you an attitude that you need to decide what's most efficient for you. And you don't just do it this way. Although a lot of teachers do that. They said, this is the way to do it. But there are really good teachers that say, you find the way. This is what the goal is. The goal is to play this passage, or the goal is to play this excerpt. And, that's the goal.
I love that. I love that idea. And so everybody's natural tempo might be a little bit different, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What a great idea. Because we just sort of like shoehorn every student to the same thing. You're going to do this 60 on the metronome, and you're going to play long tones like that. And maybe the best a lot of us will do, I'm blaming myself here too, is like tell them to think about being relaxed as they're doing that, right? But no, that's okay. That's fascinating. I'll make sure to link up to those YouTube videos too, so people can see like examples of what we're talking about.
There's a video that I did of pivoting, which is, I didn't pivot. I didn't use pivots when I went to François Rabbath. It was all about shifting, from position to position, which is a very Simandl-oriented technique. How many positions are there in Simandl? There's like 27?
Something like that, yeah.
In François' technique, there are 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and they follow the harmonic series. So it's much like violin technique. And so I think, okay, well, how do you get from one position to another? And so he says, it's very easy. You would just pivot. Pivot. Okay, I've never done it before. So the YouTube video is about pivoting. And I even do from like what we call first position to third position in François' technique. It's at the base of the neck. You go boom, 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 boom. And I think of that as a pivot. Imagine doing from first to third, to do a perfect fifth essentially in a pivot. Well, then now the pivot is from your elbow. So it's just a sort of mental thing. It's more about, and actually everything you think affects what you do physically, right?
Yeah, definitely.
I'm recording these. I just wrote 2 new concertos. Anyway, I'm recording the second concerto right now, and I'm just like, I'm having these mental things. I want to get it right, We're going to listen to this. Oh, no. So immediately my muscles just got like that, right? And I can't play those freaking fast passages. And I'm like, I could do this 5 minutes ago. Well, you're freaking yourself out. So Barry Green's and Tim Galloway's book comes into my head, Inner Game of Music. It's happening right here in my studio all by myself. There's nobody listening.
Yeah, but it's like those old mental demons that we all have and those concerns. And then that just creeps into the physicality of everything we do. And I feel that myself, I start to worry about, it's going to be presented to the world. And I can feel that everything locking up too.
Well, that's the thing about warming up with no evaluation. No requirements. The only thing is to warm up. So I have these techniques where, you just swing your arms and you just move your hands around. You're not worried about pitch. You're not worried about quality of sound. So once you're warm, then you can start moving into scales and pitch and quality and all of that. Those are the things that now your body and your mind are ready. So it's kind of Zen in a way. Yeah.
Well, I've been exploring. I've met Rabbath and I've seen Rabbath play and I've talked with a lot of people and I have his books and everything, but I've never had that level of time with him like you've had. But I'll tell you, I spent many years teaching bass, very traditional Simandl kind of approach, right? From beginners through high school and that. Then I did other things and I taught university level and I wasn't really teaching beginners. And now I've gotten back into teaching beginners. And for the first time in my life, I am going through the Vance books and I'm starting people in third position. And man, it is just like a totally different way of teaching. And I'm just amazed at the progress, the rapidity, how rapid the progress is and how natural it is really starting at that place of the bay. And I feel so bad for all those students that had all those years, and I'm just noticing that things like a lot of the tension I think maybe develops just from starting down low and in half position. It's just not there when you're starting up there. And if you start someone with the idea of a pivoting and the idea of going into fourth, fifth, sixth position, they're not scared of it. It's a normal thing.
That's the problem with, that is another word that I never use in teaching. Of course, never say never, right? But I don't use in teaching, and that is difficult. Here's the thing: you give a student who you think is ready Bottesini Concerto Number 2. You give them the concerto, and you say, okay, see if you can get through the first 15 measures. It's pretty tough, but I think you can do it. And you're ready, I think. No, man, right? You give them the concerto and you say, do it. Come back with it done. And you'll be surprised. The student will come back with it the next week and know all 3 movements. And you're like, oh my God. But if you give them the thing and you say, well, here's your limit. You're only allowed to do 15 measures. They're going to come back with 15 measures and it'll sound like crap because they've got in their head from you, who's the expert, right? We got from you that they're not ready to do more than 15 measures. So they already think it's difficult before they've even looked at it, you know? So I had one student, unfortunately he's dead. He died in a car accident, but this guy, Sean Ball, and I would give him a piece of music like challenging, right? Oh, that's the other thing. I don't use the word hard or difficult, but challenging is good because I love a challenge, right? So I say, here, I want this next week. If you can do it, if you want, you know, it's up to you. You decide. Take a look at this. It's a pretty cool piece of music. He comes back. The whole thing is ready next week. I'm like, oh my God, he blew me away. And then I went, okay, well, how about this piece? You know, I give him another thing. I think it was like, you know, those Podorovsky etudes. There are 3 of them. They're really amazing, right? Check these out. These are really cool. Yeah, all 3 of them next week. Yeah, I can't. Okay, how about Findeisen, right? I give him books 1 and 2. I say, check these out, man. These are really cool. And he goes, okay. And he goes he does like 5 or 6 of them in both books in like 2 weeks. And I'm like, so I realized that, you know, because other students I had given stuff and I said, you know, you might be able to do it. You might not be. Don't worry about it. Just try it, you know. And you already, if you put in a kind of negative limit, then they immediately will limit themselves. So I do that with myself now. I write pieces of music and I go, I don't know if I can play this, but this is what I want to hear. And then I put it on the music stand and I work my ass off and I say, I'll figure it out. It just takes me some time.
Well, it must be a fun new transition being out there in Washington and writing. And you've written so much over the years. When did you start composing?
When I was 5 years old.
Really?
Yeah. I was studying piano and I wrote my first little piano ditty, you know, I don't know. And then my first bass piece was about, I must have been about 11 or something, because that's when I started on the bass. And I called it Sonatina number 1. Felingrillo, whatever that means. It was some sort of Spanish word. You know, I was living in New Mexico. And I thought, okay, and I don't know where that is. Actually, that piece got eaten up by termites that's a long story. It got eaten up by termites in Tucson. I was storing all my scores in a garage and for years. And I came to move them when I was going to move to New Mexico after Tucson, and I pulled the box down and it just fell apart, and it was full of my old pencil scores, which all went all the way back to when I was 8 years old. Nothing got eaten up. So my Sonatina number 2, which was written for David Walter, it's actually kind of a popular piece now. The Sonatina number 1 doesn't exist, right? It's a good thing. It was a piece of crap anyway. Sonatina number 2 is pretty good. Yeah, so basically pretty early. I was starting to write. I was encouraged by my mom. She said, oh, you have some good ideas. Why don't you put those down on paper? And that actually helped me, you know, learn how to write. I wasn't able to read alto clef until after I got out of college, if you can imagine. You know, who reads alto clef? But even treble clef, I had troubles with until my first year in college, I think. Yeah, because I was so into bass and bass clef. Everything was bass clef. Even my piano pieces has 2 bass clefs, you know.
Nice. It's interesting to me. Like you studied with David Walter, Shinji studied with David Walter, Frank Proto. Was it and I know David Walter composed too. So you have all these bassist composers.
He was always telling us stories of great composers, but also of great performers, and he always combined them. And he wasn't a great composer himself, David. You know, he didn't write a lot of pieces. But the pieces that he wrote had a lot of sort of, depth, humanity. But he definitely encouraged that you express yourself in any way that you can. He always told, and I'm sure Frank would love this story, he always told us that we should be senators He says, if you don't go into music, be a senator, please, please. And I'm like, why? So that you can advocate for the arts. He was really a super advocate for the arts worldwide. Everywhere he went, he said, you must be in the arts. The arts are the most important thing in life. And he's absolutely right. And of course, music being the most important art.
Where did you grow up in New Mexico?
I grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico.
Okay. My wife's from Albuquerque, so I've spent a lot of time. So how on earth did a kid from Los Alamos end up at Juilliard? Like, what's the story? Who was your teacher down there? That's a pretty cool path.
Yeah. Well, my first teacher was this guy named Don Bean. He had moved to Tucson about 10, 15 years ago to be closer to his son, who was in Phoenix. Don Bean was educated at the University of Kansas, and then he went to Los Alamos to teach music. Now, Los Alamos is still funded by the federal government as well as the state government. The schools are. And the reason is because it's a federal research center. So the public schools got a lot of extra federal money. So that means we could pay teachers a decent salary. And so Don Bean moved to Los Alamos in the 1960s in order to take a very good paying job teaching orchestra and strings at the high school. My mother, who was very astute, my mother was a cellist from age 12 until about 86. She's now 94. Okay. She's still kicking. She gave me her cello recently, and I've been loving playing it. It's just been such a great thing. So I'm getting back into cello. But anyway, she was astute, and she said, okay, I didn't want to play the cello. She said, I came home from class one day, and I had seen a bass player and a string quintet playing, high school kids. They had come to the elementary schools, and they were trying to recruit string students for the string program. And I had very good general music teachers, and they always exposed us to as much as we could be exposed to. So this quintet was playing, and I was really taken by the bass player. It was played really well. I don't remember what they were playing, but it doesn't matter. Anyway, so I went to my mom and said, I want to play the bass. I want to play the bass. I'm like 4'2" or something, or 3'4" or something. I'm really short. And she says, oh, okay. So she takes me to the cello teacher, the only good cello teacher in the town, which was Don. And she said, he wants to play the bass. And he said, you got to be kidding. And this kid's, too short. He said, but I think he could play a half-size cello. So I started on a half-size cello, and I did that for about 3.5 years. And it moved to a full-size cello. And then when I got to be about 11 years old, I said, I still want to play the bass. I want to play bass. So we were able to get a quarter-size bass, and he started me on the bass. And then I went through those first 3 Samuel Applebaum books. We call them Applebaum, of course, being from Los Alamos. Anyway, so I went through the first 3 like overnight, and I realized you don't need your third finger for the bass. That was it. And I was just like, boom, the bass is what I wanted to do. And boy, I just went crazy on the bass. So I think the advantage of Los Alamos having enough money to buy decent teachers or to pay decent teachers. And he was a really great teacher, And then he finally said, after my first or second year in high school, he said, I can't teach you anything more on the bass. You need to find a more advanced teacher and more specific for the bass, because he was a cello guy. Right? He didn't play the bass. And so at that time we started looking around, and there were a couple of people in Santa Fe. One of them was Robert Chickering. Robert Chickering had studied with Warren Benfield. And he had been playing in the Chicago Symphony for a number of years, but had moved to Santa Fe to open a restaurant. So kind of give up the bass and open a restaurant sort of thing. Although he never gave up the bass. He still plays. So I started studying with Robert Chickering. I would drive down. So now I'm in high school, and I would just drive down to Santa Fe, and we would take lessons in his restaurant. He was the next best teacher that I've ever had. I mean, he could play anything. As far as I was concerned, he could play anything. When he did Mozart 35, I was just like, I want to be able to do that, It was so fast, and it was so clean and perfect. And he had this great bass. It was a Grancino. I mean, beautiful with a rosette in the belly, and all that. So, yeah, and then we played in the Orchestra of Santa Fe in its inaugural season. He was principal bass, and I was assistant principal bass. Only two basses. Chamber orchestra. It was conducted by William Kirschke. So I was 15 years old when I got my first orchestral job. Then I went like that. So that was Bob Chickering. Then I studied with Hal Robinson, who was in New Mexico for a while. He was principal bass of New Mexico Symphony and teaching at the university for a little bit. And he would drive up to Los Alamos to teach a bunch of kids. And I would take lessons from him. And then after that, Barry Green, Lucas Drew in the Congress of Strings. And so here's an interesting story. So I went to college at Eastman School in 1976. And to study with, at that time, I wanted to study with Oscar Zimmerman. And I'd heard a lot about Oscar Zimmerman. I don't know how, but I did. And my father had said, he didn't want me to go to school, a music school, but he said, get in the best school you can. So I got into Eastman School. I went to study with Oscar Zimmerman, but during the summer, after I got accepted in the summer, he got released from the school, and James Vandermark got hired. So I studied with James Vandermark for the 1 year, and although I thought James was a great player, I didn't feel like he was teaching me anything about music. And what I really wanted was how to interpret music. That was very important to me. I knew how to play. I wanted to know how to interpret. And he was great at telling you how to play. So I called up Bob Chickering, I called up Barry Green and Lucas Drew, and also Paul Ellison. Now, Paul Ellison had only come up to Los Alamos to do some recruiting for Rice, and we had met, and I had played for him, and he was working on getting me a Rice scholarship, and he got me one, but I chose Eastman instead of Rice, just for the name. Rice was like 1 year old then, and so I was thinking, well, Eastman's established, blah blah blah, all these my mentors from my high school years, and I said, who should I study with? Because I'm not enjoying my Eastman experience, and so Paul Ellison said, well, if you don't come down to Rice, you should study because they all knew me, right? You should study with David Walter. I said, who's David Walter? I had no idea. I called up Barry Green, and I asked him the same question. He said, well, if you don't study with me at Cincinnati, you should study with David Walter. Who's this David Walter guy? I called up. I'm telling you, every single one of these teachers said exactly the same thing. I called up Bob Chickering, and he said, well, if you don't study with Warren Benfield, you should study with David Walter. Okay, so I look up this David Walter guy. He's at Juilliard, and so I auditioned for Juilliard. And that was between going to the Spoleto Festival. And so I went to the Spoleto Festival immediately after auditioning for Juilliard, literally immediately after. I took my trunk and everything. I came back from Spoleto and moved to New York. It was a really tumultuous time. So I get to New York, right? And I play, and David Walter's not there. He's off with he's at the festival up there in New Jersey. I can't remember the name of it. So he's not there. And I auditioned for Homer Mensch and John Schaefer for David Walter's class, and they accept me for David Walter, of course. So on my first day of classes, first day of registration. At that time, there were no computers, so we had to do it all by hand, and we had to sit in the hall and wait for our name to be called, and we go. Anyway, so he said, okay, you're with David Walter, good. You give him a call and set up your lessons. So I give him a call, and he says, who are you? I don't know who you are. I don't know your name. I said, well, I was accepted by Maestros Schaefer and Mensch for your class. He says, yeah, but I haven't heard you play. You can't be in my class without me hearing you play. I thought, God, who is this jerk, right? He says, okay, I'll tell you what. Can you come at 10 o'clock on Saturday, which was like 3 days from then? And I said, yes, of course. And he says, okay, that will be your audition. And it might be your first lesson. So I arrived there, and I'm completely, racked with nerves. First I asked him, I said, well, what should I prepare? And he says, all major and minor scales in at least 2 octaves. What do you got to play? I said, well, I have some Bach and some Bottesini. He says, that'll be fine. So I get to the studio, right? And I get through the door with my stool and with my bass, and I'm like, clanking around and everything, and I unpack it, and I'm totally freaked out. And he says, "Okay, just calm down. What do you got to play?" I said, "Well, I got some Bach, this Bottesini elegy, Bottesini introduction and Gavotte and stuff." He says, "Okay, let's hear some scales." I said, "Okay, scales. What do you want? How about B major?" I said, "Any particular rhythm?" He said, "No, just play." So I play B major. He says, "How about D flat minor?" I said, "Okay, D flat minor." You think I don't remember this stuff? I really do. He says, "Okay, let's hear the rest of this stuff." So I play a Bach suite a little bit. I think I played 2 movements. Probably bourrées, right? And then played some Bottesini elegy and then introduction and Gavotte. And through the whole thing, he's really great. He says, "Well, have you ever thought of this? Have you ever thought of that? What about doing it this way? Have you ever thought maybe you should, on and on." It was a great lesson. It lasted for like an hour and 15 minutes. And he finally says, "Okay, you're done." I'm like, okay. And I get my stool and I'm going out the door and I'm trying to negotiate the door with my stool and everything. And it's like hitting me in the back and it's a heavy steel door, And he goes, oh, wait a second. I turn around and I say, "Yes, maestro." And he says, "I'll accept you as a student."
Oh, man. Wow.
The thing I learned about that lesson in retrospect is that this man knows timing better than anybody I'd ever met. And when it comes to his musical interpretation, it's all about timing. And, the only other person that I really, really respect in the way they time their drama in music is somebody like, David Walter. I mean, he's just amazing about timing. Actually, Edgar Meyer, not a bad. The way he times his drama is pretty good too. But there's a lot of bass players that time well. But anyway, that's what he taught me right away was that how you time things. And so when he tells a joke, the timing's amazing. When he's building up any kind of musical phrase, it's always about how you time the phrase and everything. So. Yeah, pretty amazing.
Nice. Kind of makes me brings me back to what we were talking about earlier with the natural tempo of things. So you were talking about
one thing that young students always do is they go too fast on a rising line, and they'll slow down on a lowering line often. Or same thing with piano and forte, right? Forte goes faster and piano goes slower. So that was the one thing that, he says, as you rise, you need to increase the tension, make it even more exciting, like that. A lot of things, about color. It was always about color. So play me this passage. He said, okay, da-da-da-da. He says, what color is that phrase? I'm like, well, I don't know. What do you mean? He said, well, take that note, that D flat right there. It drops down to the C. What color is the D flat and what color is the C? I'm like, what color? And they say, yeah, and what texture? I want a little velvet on that, or maybe a little ginger on this one. I wrote an article about that when he passed away. I wrote an article called "Give Me a Little Paprika." And I didn't know what paprika was, but he was always doing that. He was always equating music phrase with taste, texture, and color. And boy, it just that, I still do that. The other thing he would always have me do is put numbers over phrases, over pitches within a phrase. What number is this pitch as far as dynamic is concerned? Now, dynamic is more than just volume, right? It's also intensity, timbre, color, and all that kind of stuff. They say, give me 1 to 10 or 0 to 10 on, your dynamic for every note. So I have all these little numbers all over every note, But it was a good way to help you interpret. It was just one of hundreds of tools that he has given me to be a creative expresser of the page, because the page is nothing, right? It's just little dots on a piece of paper. So what do you do with those dots? That's what he learned. That's what he taught me how to do. He was the best person for it. And I thank all of those other teachers who recommended that to me, because it really completely made me who I am.
Well, it's just really cool. Like you and Barry and Paul and all these players, like right around at the same time, kind of getting into the Rabbath technique and kind of popularizing that. And then George Vance's books coming out, and I'm just sort of noticing, and I love watching this unfold, because I'm older than these people that are coming up now that are getting jobs. I just turned 40, and it's fun to see the people that are like in their early 20s that started with that approach, right? And just where I'm just seeing this wave of people coming that really got started a little more like a Suzuki violinist would have gotten started, right? Like with the more progressive, in my opinion, position concept of the Rabbath chops. And if they approach it that way, they're hitting the Dragonetti concerto when they're in like 7th grade, like I think back to when I was 18 or so, Dragonetti. I mean, I was auditioning for my undergrad with Dragonetti, and I felt very progressive.
Yeah. No, it's really well. Ted Botsford is one of those that grew up on the at the Vance seminars, and that's why I met him there. And he stayed with that whole Rabbath, and then of course he studied with François. François is one who didn't have an orchestral career until he was 50 or something. So it's new things are not easily accepted in a world that is based in tradition. The nice thing about the bass world is that it's a little more open to changing things. Look at all the different shapes we've got now, removable necks, different materials. I mean, look at the number of strings. When I was a kid, there was one type of string that you would use. It was Parastro Flexicor. That was it, And if you were a jazzer, you might use Spiracor. And now there are 100 different models, at least 100. It's just unbelievable. And so part of that is driven by economics. People want to make something new so they can make money, string makers and stuff. But part of it is driven by the desire for a more expressive way of doing things, a more maybe even easier way of doing things. A bass is a large instrument, like the viola, underneath yours. Viola is also going through some good change, but violin is stuck, and there's good reason for it. It's a great shape. It works really well, but the technique seems to have petered out, and meaning its progressivity has kind of stopped. There are not too many. I mean, there are violinists that go into different media, different genres, but the ones that are the best players are the ones that are using a traditional technique. So I think violin, even though it seems to be stuck as far as its technique is concerned, it works. It works really well. And the problem with bass is that we've had all of these different tries. Well, let's see if this works. And we're all different sizes and shapes, the people, and the instruments. And we just haven't really come down to anything that's sort of violin-like, in that there's nothing specific about the bass. And in fact, I've been experimenting with different tunings for years. And now I am consistently playing with a fifth on the bottom and a fifth on the top and a fifth in the middle. So it's all D. It's A, D, A, D. Yeah. And it's so cool. My bass just goes, wow. It loves it, A D bass. I mean, if you look at the 18th century, right, the Viennese double bass, it was a D bass. It was a bass in D. And, I thought, well, maybe I should just play everything in D and see. Edgar Meyer does the same thing. He plays with a low E string, but in solo tuning, right? So A, E, B, E. But G, D, A, D is very common for me in the orchestra. And now I do it for everything. G, D, A, D, or if I'm doing solo, I do A, D, A, D. And then I'm playing cello at the same time. So I actually use both techniques on both instruments now. They're enhancing each other. I'm learning a lot right now playing the cello.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Great to chat with you. And folks, check out everything he's up to at patrickneher.com. And that's going to do it for another episode of Contrabass Conversations. So great to be on this journey with you. Thank you for listening. Be sure to share this with a friend. I'm sure there's somebody you have in your life that hasn't listened to one of these. They've got a big back catalog to go through if that's the case. But thank you for following along. I really appreciate it. Don't hesitate to reach out. Feedback at contrabassconversations.com. I'd love to hear from you. Are you going to be at a bass event coming up? Do you have something you'd like me to share on the show? Let me know. So that's it for this week. We will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.